The silent escape the moment. 4,000 Tartarian bells disappeared from history. There are disappearances in history that leave no witnesses, no records, and no explanation. Among them is one of the quietest, yet most unsettling: the loss of nearly 4,000 bronze bells, once found across the vast territories. European mapmakers labeled simply as Tartaria. These bells appear in early photographs from Siberia, the Central Asian steppe, and old frontier settlements, hanging above wooden churches, resting beside monasteries, or suspended in open-air frames that overlooked endless snow. Their inscriptions reference localities that later changed names, regions later absorbed into new borders, and administrative divisions erased during cartographic reform. And then they vanish. Their inventories stop, their weights and inscriptions disappear from church registers. Photographs show them one year and never again the next. No event clearly explains their removal. No archive records where they were moved. Yet the timing is striking. The bells fade from documentation. At the same moment, the name Tartaria disappears from Western maps, replaced by modern geographic terms. One surviving photograph becomes the final trace. A quiet, almost accidental image showing several of these bronze shapes together for the last time. After this moment, history offers only silence. What happened to the bells? Why did their records end so abruptly? And why does their disappearance coincide with the erasure of Tartaria itself? This is where the investigation begins. To understand the disappearance of nearly 4,000 Tartarian bells, we must first return to the pieces of evidence that still remain. Not the theories, not the assumptions, but the physical traces history has preserved in fragments, maps, photographs, metallurgy reports, architecture, travel notes, and ecclesiastical inventory, scattered across the vast lands once labeled Tartaria. Because before the silence there was sound, and before the absence there were records. One old maps and the borders that shifted. From the 16th to the 19th century, European mapmakers used the name Tartaria to label an immense region stretching across Siberia, Central Asia, Mongolia, and parts of northern China. These maps were not legends or symbolic decorations. They were official geographic documents from Amsterdam, London, Paris, Venice, Vienna, and St. Petersburg. On them, the territory appears clearly divided: Great Tartaria, Siberian Tartaria, Little Tartaria, Chinese Tartaria, Independent Tartaria. Each variation marked different administrative or cultural distinctions, as understood by European cartographers. Yet there is one detail rarely discussed. Many towns, forts, and frontier settlements marked in these maps were recorded as having bell towers or ecclesiastical structures, even in regions without strong urban development. The presence of bells is not unusual, but the number is. Travelers from the 17th, 18th centuries wrote descriptions of remote wooden churches in Siberia or Central Asian mission stations that carried large bronze bells, far too heavy, far too ornate, and far too well crafted for the isolated settlements they served. These bells were not temporary, nor were they small. In some reports they weighed hundreds of kilograms, which leads us to the next piece of evidence. Two photographs from the 1800s. One photography arrived in Russia and Central Asia in the mid-1800s. Early photographers captured villages, monasteries, and frontier towns, often inadvertently documenting the bells hanging above them. Across multiple photo archives, we find a wooden church in Ir, with 3 bronze bells from the early 1700s, a monastery near Tomsk, with a row of bells suspended in an open frame, a mission settlement in the Altai region, with a single massive bell, almost disproportionate to the building beneath it, old Buryat and Yakut churches, with clusters of bells whose casting styles match pre-industrial European techniques, bells and Central Asian trading posts, tied to names that no longer appear on modern maps. None of these photographs are disputed. They exist in public archives. The bells are visible. They are clearly older than the structures around them. Their inscriptions match dates from the 1600s and 1700s. And then, after a certain point in the early 20th century, these bells simply stop appearing in photographic. Metallurgical clue: the 1740 threshold. Throughout Europe and Eurasia, bells cast before 1740 hold a unique status in inventories, not because of myth, but because of metallurgy. Pre-1740 bells often contain higher tin content, lower contamination from industrial smelting, distinctive alloy ratio seen in pre-factory casting, hand-inscribed marks from regional foundries. These bells fall into historical preservation categories in many archives. This means they were catalogued separately, often exempted from destruction during resource collection, noted for artistic and cultural value, recorded in ecclesiastical registers with detailed descriptions. In Eurasia, especially regions once labeled Tartaria, an unusually high proportion of existing bells were from before 1740. This aligns with missionary expansions, frontier fort establishment, and early colonial layouts of Russian Siberia. Yet today, thousands of these bells from the Tartarian regions are missing, with no record showing where they went for administrative inventories and their breaks. Church administrative records in Siberia and Central Asia often include bell weights, inscriptions, casting origins, relocation notes, condition reports. Many such registers survive, but with gaps. For example, a church inventory from 1884 lists 5 bells with inscriptions dating 1697, 1712, 1724, 1736, and 1 unknown. A follow-up inventory from 1902 lists only 1, the smallest. No explanation is provided. In other regions, bells are recorded in 1861, then again in 1874, and then the next surviving document jumps to 1911, with empty bell sections. These are not isolated anomalies. The pattern repeats across multiple provinces. The silence in the paperwork mirrors the silence in the soundscape. 5. The photograph, the last known moment. Among several regional archives, researchers identify one photograph, a quiet black and white image, showing a collection of older bronze bells together. Believed to be from the 1700s, the photo was taken in a storage yard near a frontier monastery sometime in the early 1900s. On the ground beneath them, faint inscriptions are visible. Dates 1701, 1718, 17305. Casting origins, names of vanished settlements. Weight markings typical of early hand-cast bronze. This photograph is important for one reason. It is the last confirmed visual evidence of multiple Tartarian region bells before they disappear from the archives entirely. After this image, there are no follow-up inventories, no purchase or melting records, no transfer documents, no announcements, no retrieval attempts. The bells vanish from both the physical and administrative landscapes. A disappearance not linked to any single event, yet too consistent to be ignored. 6. What historians agree on. No historian claims the bells were part of a unified system. No historian asserts a single moment caused their removal. But there is agreement on a few facts. Old bells existed across the Tartarian territories. Many were passed before 1740. They appear in maps, travel accounts, and photographs. Their inventories stop abruptly. Their disappearance correlates with administrative and cartographic reforms in the region. No central archive explains where they went. The evidence is not sensational, it is subtle. A silence formed not by myth, but by missing paperwork. Lost registries, renamed places, and transitions that erased the context needed to understand what happened. And this brings us to the greater mystery. The bells did not simply vanish. Their records vanished with them. And when documentation disappears from multiple places at once, historians must consider not what is told, but what is not. When historians trace objects through time, the path is usually linear. An inventory, a relocation, an inspection, a record of repair, an eventual replacement. But with the Tartarian region bells, the path breaks, not in one place, but in many, and not gradually, but suddenly. What remains today is not a single mystery, but a pattern of inconsistencies scattered across maps, timelines, architecture, and administrative records. These are not theories. They are the gaps the archives themselves reveal. 1. The vanishing construction records. Across Siberia, Central Asia, and the far north, early missionaries and frontier builders documented the construction of churches, chapels, and outposts. Their journals survive, their sketches survive. Sometimes even their supply logs survive. Yet one crucial element does not. There are almost no records describing the transportation or installation of large bronze bells. This is unusual for several reasons. Bells weighing hundreds of kilograms would require carts or sledges, long-distance transport through forests or frozen rivers is difficult. Local communities often recorded large donations or castings. Moving a bell was an event worth noting in village archives, and yet, across large stretches of Tartarian territories, churches appear in records. Their bells appear in photographs, but the delivery of those bells does not. It creates a strange paradox. We know the bells were there. We just don't know how they arrived. This absence raises two possibilities. The bells predated the structures built around them. Their documentation was stored in administrative centers that later dissolved or changed name. Both are historically plausible, but neither explains the scale of missing information. To the buildings that appear fully complete in multiple early photographs from the 1800s, wooden churches, monasteries, and frontier chapels appear fully constructed with bells already installed, yet with no photographic progression showing foundation, work frame, raising, bell hoisting, finishing stages. This is not unusual for cities in Western Europe, where photography arrived after construction booms. But it is unusual for frontier regions, where photographers were already present during building periods. For example, a mission church in the Yenisei region appears in an 1860 photo with 3 bells already hung, yet no prior images capture its earlier stages, despite the same photographer documenting other structures nearby. A settlement in the Altai region shows a bell frame in 1871 with 5 pre-17 bells, even though no record states when they were acquired. Monasteries in Transbaikalia show rows of bells in 1880s images, but their construction logs mention only timber deliveries and icon panels. The inconsistency is simple but striking. We see the bells only when the structures are finished, never before. 3 architectural features ahead of their context. Some bells in the Tartarian regions were housed in frames or towers with design features that, according to architectural appear out of place. Examples include multi-tiered bell frames, similar to those found in Western Russia, but appearing farther east, decades earlier than documented migrations. Ornamental fittings showing casting styles typical of early 1700s European foundries, despite the surrounding buildings being attributed to late 1800s construction. Bell inscriptions referencing donor families or administrative divisions that disappeared before modern surveys were conducted. None of these details imply impossibility, but they do imply discontinuity. A bell dated 1712, hanging in a church built in 1883 is not unusual, but the absence of relocation records is a frame designed in a style introduced 40 years later in Western regions is not miraculous, but its lack of attribution is. Historians often remind, what is unexplained is not impossible. It is simply undocumented. But repeated undocumented anomalies form a pattern for maps that shift while objects stay still. Old maps of Siberia and Central Asia show borders that changed rapidly across the 17th to 19th centuries. Provinces renamed, settlements absorbed, regions merged, administrative lists reorganized. This matters because bell inventories were tied to those administrative boundaries. When a province changed name, its records were refiled. Its churches were reassigned. Its registers were recopied. Some documents were discarded. This is normal in our archival history. But the inconsistency emerges here. Certain bells remain listed in older divisions, long after the divisions themselves disappeared. Example pattern. A bell listed in Yakut Tartaria in 1820. The region renamed in 1822. Inventory updated in 1834, still using the old division. Next surviving record in 1890 shows the bell missing entirely. This isn't evidence of conspiracy. It's evidence of administrative fragmentation, which often leads to lost context. But what makes it unusual is the scale. Thousands of bells show similar documentary fractures in the same historic window. 5 unexplained population shifts and lost parishes. Throughout the 19th century, parts of the Tartarian region saw forced relocations, village abandonment, consolidation of settlements, relocation of missions, frontier reorganization. When a community moved, its bells typically moved with it. Yet in many archival trails, the village relocation is recorded. The bell is mentioned in earlier records, but no document describes what happened to it afterward. It leaves a peculiar footprint. People moved, boundaries shifted, but bells do not move quietly, and yet the records fall silent. 6. The final inventory break across multiple provinces once considered part of Tartaria. A pattern emerges. Inventory year X bell recorded. Inventory year X 12 bell recorded. Inventory year X plus 25 bell gone. No explanation listed. This is not one province, not one archive, not one type of church, it is widespread. The inconsistency is not that bells disappeared. Objects are lost all the time. The inconsistency is how they disappeared. At the same historical moment. Across thousands of kilometers, without relocation notes, without destruction records, without transfer logs. And this is what historians quietly acknowledge. The administrative silence is more unusual than the disappearance itself. 7. The core mystery. We do not have a single piece of evidence explaining why these bells vanished. We have many small inconsistencies that together create a pattern. Missing construction records. Photographs showing bells with no origin trail. Buildings completed with no documentation for their bells. Maps changing while inventories stay outdated. Population shifts with no bell transfers. Archive breaks synchronized across regions. No single inconsistency is extraordinary. It is the collection that makes the disappearance of 4,000 Tartarian bells a legitimate historical question. And so the investigation moves deeper, not into speculation, but into the quiet spaces where history stops speaking. Silence in history is rarely accidental. Archives fall quiet for reasons political, administrative, linguistic, or simply practical. But in the case of the Tartarian bells, the silence is layered. A silence of documents, a silence of maps, a silence of names, and a silence of memory. To understand why nearly 4,000 bronze bells disappeared without explanation, we must examine the parallel disappearance of something much larger. The name Tartaria itself, the name that faded from maps. For more than 3 centuries, European cartographers consistently labeled a vast region across Siberia, Central Asia and northern China as Tartaria. This term was not peripheral or decorative. It appeared in Dutch atlases, Phoenician charts, French encyclopedias, British imperial maps, Russian frontier surveys. And then between the late 1800s and early 1900s, something subtle yet unmistakable happened. The word Tartaria quietly vanished. Not with an announcement, not with a political decree, not with an international conference. It simply faded out of use, as modern administrative names replaced older geographic labels. Siberia Central, Asia Turkestan, Manchuria Far East, Russian Empire. This shift was not hidden, but it was gradual, enough that few noticed its consequence. When a geographic name disappears from official documents, the context attached to it disappears too. And because many bell registries, missionary records and frontier inventories were tied to these older divisions, the disappearance of the name Tartaria created an administrative gap through which thousands of objects, including bells, slipped out of documentation to changing borders, changing archives. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, the regions formerly grouped under Tartaria underwent enormous reorganizations. Old provinces were dissolved, merged, districts formed. New administrative centers replaced old ones. Towns changed name, villages relocated. Churches reassigned to new dioceses. Each transition required recopying documents, reorganizing archives, discarding outdated registries, reassigning inventories under new names. In such transitions, objects tied to the old administrative structure often lost their trace. A bell listed in Eastern might become unlisted when that region was renamed. A parish belonging to a dissolved district may not have had its bell records copied into the new structure. A monastery moved its headquarters, but not its paperwork. Silence entered in the form of missing clerical transitions. Not intentional, not malicious. Simply the quiet erosion of context through bureaucratic change. 3. Lost ecclesiastical records. Church archives in the Tartarian regions suffered additional vulnerabilities: fires, relocations, desolations of monastic estates, mergers of parishes, migration of communities, lack of climate control in remote archives, wartime damage in later decades. Many church registries that did survive show pages missing specifically from the sections listing bells, weights, inscriptions, donors, casting dates. What is most striking is not the incompleteness itself, but the timing of the gaps. A significant number of missing bell records cluster around the same decades in which Tartaria was phased out of Western cartography. The name changed, the structure changed, and the soundscape attached to that name slipped through the cracks of the transition. For the silence of renaming. When a region changes name, cultural objects sometimes lose their identity in the process. A bell originally inscribed with Chinese Tartaria, Independent Tartaria, Siberian Tartaria, suddenly became classified under unfamiliar administrative titles. Archivists recopied inventories using the new district names, but often omitted the old ones, leaving bells with inscriptions referring to places that no longer existed on paper. This is not unusual. It happens when empires restructure territories. But here lies the subtle issue. If an object references a place that no longer exists, and no one copies the original description, the object becomes orphaned in the archive. Once orphaned, it becomes vulnerable to removal, misplacement, or omission in later inventories. Multiply this process across thousands of kilometers and hundreds of administrative transitions, and the disappearance of 4,000 bells becomes more comprehensible, though still deeply unsettling. 5. The quiet removal of local memory. In many frontier communities, memory was oral, not written. When villages relocated due to shifting borders, harsh winters, famine, or political reorganization, the bells often remained behind, heavy, immovable, unsuited for transport across long distances. A village could move, a parish could merge, a monastery could be dissolved, but the bell stayed, and without the community that knew its origin, the bell effectively lost its identity. Later administrators encountering a bell without documentation often left it unrecorded, repurposed it, moved it to storage, or removed it entirely. Silence again, not through intention, but through abandonment of context. 6. The convergence of two silences. When we overlaid the disappearance of the name Tartaria from official usage, the disappearance of bells from inventories, a striking alignment appears. It does not suggest a hidden event. It suggests a convergence. Administrative restructuring, map reform, renaming, loss of local communities, archived documents, destroyed or uncopied, regional reorganizations, all occurring in the same window of time. And because bells are heavy, difficult to move, expensive to store, easy to reap, overlooked when their inscriptions were misunderstood, they became casualties of historical transition. Not a single event, but a chain of quiet erasers. One silence built upon another. 7. What is missing today? When modern researchers attempt to trace the bells across museum holdings, church registries, date archives, photo collections, private journals, metallurgical records, they find a consistent absence. Missing serial numbers, missing inventories, missing casting logs, missing relocation notes, missing parish transitions, missing maps showing which bells belong and where. The gap is so consistent across such a wide area that historians cannot dismiss it as chance. Something happened, not dramatic, not singular, but systematic in its effect. The silence is not the sound of an event. It is the sound of fragmented paperwork, of renamed places, of administrative transitions that quietly erased the context needed to interpret the past. The bells likely did not vanish all at once. What vanished was the record that once held them in place. This is the silence of Tartaria. The silence of a name erased, a region redefined, and thousands of objects stranded in the transition. There is a moment in every historical investigation where the facts end, and what remains is the quiet space between them. A space filled not with speculation, but with the questions we are left to carry. The disappearance of the Tartarian bells belongs to that space, because when nearly 4,000 bronze bells go missing from inventories, from photographs, from regional memory, and when their disappearance aligns with the gradual erasure of the name Tartaria from maps, we are confronted not with a solved puzzle, but with a pattern of absences. Absence of records, absence of names, absence of continuity, absence of explanation. And in that absence lies the reflection. One, what happens when a name disappears? Names are anchors. They hold together a region's identity, its stories, its objects, its memory. When the name Tartaria faded from maps in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it did more than redraw geography. It redrew understanding. A bell inscribed with Chinese Tartary becomes confusing when the region no longer holds that name. A church catalogued under Siberian Tartary becomes difficult to locate when maps adopt new borders. A settlement once listed as part of independent Tartary becomes untraceable when absorbed into a different administrative structure. So, what happens next? The objects tied to those vanished names lose their coordinates in history. They still exist for a time, but unmoored, unanchored, vulnerable to being overlooked, mislabeled, or forgotten. And so the bells become metaphors for the region itself, visible once, clear once, mapped once, then quietly absorbed into something larger, until the edges blur and the origin dissolves. To how much of history is built on missing chapters? Historians build narratives from surviving fragments. But what about the fragments that do not survive? A missing inventory page, a lost monastery registry, a map overwritten by new borders, a village renamed with no trace of the previous one, an administrative center dissolved, a bell whose inscription references a place the modern world no longer recognizes. None of these alone are remarkable, but together they form a reminder. History is not a complete book. It is a collection of pages that happen to survive. The missing bells invite a quiet question. If an object disappears from the archive, did it disappear from the world, or only from our ability to remember it? The bells may not have vanished physically at all. They may have been repurposed, relocated, melted, stored, moved to another parish, left behind in abandoned settlements. But without the paperwork, the story ends in silence. 3. The paradox of evidence. There is a paradox in studying the old Tartarian regions. The more evidence we find, the more questions emerge. Old maps showed, but why did the label last so long, then vanish so quickly? Photos show bells in remote frontier towns, but why are there no records of their delivery or removal? Inventories list pre-1740 bells, but why does so many listings disappear after a certain time window? Architecture shows completed structures with bells, but why do construction logs omit them? None of these gaps prove anything mysterious, yet none of them are fully explained by the surviving documents. We stand between two truths: what the evidence clearly shows, what the evidence does not explain. In that space, the Tartarian bells become more than physical objects. They become indicators of how fragile historical continuity truly is for a sound that outlasted its people. A bell is more than bronze, it is a mark of presence, of community, of ritual, of time. When a bell rings, it announces a village exists. When a bell is recorded in an inventory, it becomes part of the administrative world. When a bell appears in a photograph, it becomes part of the visual record. But when that bell is no longer heard, listed, or seen, the community that once gathered beneath it slowly fades from memory as well. The disappearance of the Tartarian bells, then, raises a question larger than methodology or paperwork. How many communities, how many stories vanished with them? Not because someone intended it, not because a single event removed them, but because time eroded their traces step by quiet step. 5. The philosophical echo. The deeper we go into the silence of Tartaria, the more the investigation turns inward. The bells disappeared, the name disappeared, the administrative boundaries disappeared, the context disappeared. All that remains is the question: how much of our understanding of the past depends on what happened to survive, rather than what actually existed? What else has slipped through the cracks? How many regions carried different names before our modern maps settled into shape? How many objects, bells, icons, tools, structures once defined a place whose identity is now repackaged under another name? And then the quietest question of all: if 4,000 bronze bells can disappear from history, not in myth, not in legend, but in the gaps between documents, what else have we lost without knowing? 6. What the bells leave behind. The Tartarian bells are gone from the record, but their absence leaves something behind, a reminder that history is not only written in what is found, but in what is missing. Their disappearance is not an ending. It is a doorway not to speculation but to humility, because in the silence of the Tartarian bells, we are faced with the quiet truth. We do not know everything. We do not have every page. And the past is larger than the limits of our archives. The bells may never be found. Their records may never be recovered. Their origin stories may never be fully traced. But their silence teaches us to listen more carefully to the missing pieces, the absences that shape our understanding, just as much as the evidence that remains. And in that silence, the investigation turns toward its final chapter. The trail ends where the silence begins. We have followed the bells across maps that changed their names, through photographs that captured their last known shapes, into archives whose pages thinned with every administrative shift. We trace their inscriptions, their weights, their casting dates, and the vanished towns they once belonged to. But like all stories built from fragments, the path eventually dissolves. The bells do not return. Their locations remain unlisted. Their final purpose remains unknown. And the name of the land that once held them, Tut, slips into the margins of old atlases, as if the world simply turned the page and forgot to finish the chapter. In this quiet, concluding moment, we are left not with answers but with echoes. Echoes of bronze that once marked time across frozen plains. Echoes of communities whose names changed faster than their memories could follow. Echoes of borders redrawn until nothing familiar remained. Echoes of voices not lost but unrecorded. History often ends this way, not with an event but with a pause. Not with a conclusion but with a missing link. Not with certainty, but with a space we can only observe, not fill. And so the bells become symbols of something larger. The fragility of record keeping, the impermanence of names, the vulnerability of objects, when the world around them shifts. As the last photograph fades to monochrome, we see the bells suspended in a quiet yard, covered in frost, waiting for a future that never came. After that moment, their sound is gone, replaced by an absence so complete that even the archives fall silent. We are left with a final thought, simple, unresolved, and honest. If thousands of bronze bells can disappear from history without a trace, what else have we forgotten? Simply because no one wrote it down. The camera pulls back, the landscape blurs, the documents close, and the silence deepens. Not dark, not ominous, but contemplative. A reminder that history is not a fixed story, but a shifting coastline of memory and omission. And somewhere in the vast spaces once called Tartaria, the echo of a bell we can no longer hear still lingers in the imagination. Thank you for taking the time to follow. If you find this content meaningful, please subscribe so you don't miss the next stories.